This is John Nugent.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class. Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Today marks a large milestone in the podcast world for us. Not really, but we've had Todd Jones along for the ride for the last 11 episodes, and this is the 12th. And he's been gracefully walking us through the spiritual disciplines, but his time has come to an end.
I will still be alive after this, right? It's like
I was not aware of that
end
fact.
on the podcast.
And in the building.
Yes.
He'll still be in the office next door.
Yes, you will.
But he may or may not be on the podcast in the future. But definitely, this is the last one for this series that Todd will be with. And so we do thank you, Todd, for you guiding us through and bringing all your knowledge of this topic. Hopefully you as an audience have enjoyed it.
He's been super gracious and patient and resilient with, he brings up a definition and attack.
You couldn't be dumber right now, Todd.
Great talking.
And people have criticized our, attack and definition, but in defense of the three of us, he kept starting with it. It's like
you don't like it. Why do you keep bringing it up?
So, there must have been some value in that part of each episode.
And I'm sure you're going to be very happy to get a little bit of your extra time back because it's not like you're just sitting around twiddling your thumbs. You've got a lot going on in your life, and being able to take one thing off of your plate's got to feel pretty good.
Yeah, I think I've got about 4,000 pages of reading and about 60 pages of papers to write in 2 months. It's going to be a busy summer.
So for those of you who've reached out and said you need to make Todd a permanent fixture, not in the immediate future. He's got a lot of other things to do, and we want to respect the fact that he wants to get his doctorate degree. And the college is probably going to be starting an additional podcast that focuses on preaching, and Todd might be an integral part of that. So... but who knows? God may bring the four of us together again on this podcast, or one of us might drop out and you might be the replacement.
There you go.
Where do I sign up?
Many possible futures here.
Yeah, but I would say if you have enjoyed Todd, drop a line on our Facebook page of this episode, and maybe the general uproar of why he's leaving, maybe we'll have to be forced to bring him back, like some TV show.
We didn't want to, but popular opinion dictated what we do here, as it always does.
The masses have spoken.
Exactly.
I kind of want to experience Todd on an episode where he's not the one having to lead, where he can just be one of the voices in the chorus without having to do all the work. I think I still want to see how you do it in that mode.
I can be strongly contrarian at that point.
Right? yeah. Like I think you have to be the one kind of holding it. You can't be the antagonist. But I wonder what it would be like to have Todd without him having to be the responsible one.
With that definition.
You can tell us we couldn't be dumber right now.
That's right.
Which is fine. I hear that at home all the
thought
time.
you guys had doctorates. What's wrong with you?
Well, I didn't know people were asking me to become a permanent fixture on the podcast.
Yeah, too.
It has been brought up.
Hey,
yeah.
more than zero. I was, I thought I was mostly being tolerated here, but it's been a good run. I've enjoyed this. It is a little extra work for me, but it's been work that's worth doing, and
no extra money.
Yeah, well, not much that we do gives us extra money. Let's be honest.
Not at all.
But yeah, as I shared in the beginning, kind of wish fulfillment a little bit as well. I mean, I've admired the podcast as a listener for a number of years now, so it's been very cool to be a part of this.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, glad to have you. Don't start crying.
Are we? Are we ready to shred our final definition?
Let's do it. I'm feeling it.
Well, you may recall Foster's book is called Celebration of Discipline, and so in a fitting ending, we're closing out on the spiritual discipline of celebration. Celebration is the last of the corporate disciplines and the last of the disciplines overall. One last disclaimer, Foster nor the podcast are claiming these are the only 12 disciplines that exist, but these are some kind of main categories, and it's a helpful starting point and puts a cap on the series, so we're not here for the next year. So Foster's definition for celebration. Celebration is a discipline of the spirit that involves choosing to acknowledge and enjoy the goodness of God, regardless of circumstances.
Okay. Go ahead.
Why is the spirit in this one?
Yeah.
And not all the others?
I thought the same thing.
Fine. Only in celebration do we get the work of the Spirit there.
There's a chance. I should interject quickly. There's a chance that was me. It's been a year ago since I put those notes together. That might be me trying to clarify something for the class. I
So you
don't
think that's
remember.
not fostered?
That might not be Foster, actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
So why did you put it here and not insert it into all the other ones, if that's the case?
Well, the truth is I can't remember. I did copy and paste this from the slide that I use in class. But the a discipline of the Spirit, I think, is the reminder as we're closing out on the corporate disciplines that the corporate disciplines are a celebration of the Spirit in our midst, for one thing, that God is moving, that God is communicating with the church as a whole, that we get to experience that. And it's very easy to forget, given the reputation that Christianity has had as a kind of like a joyless, now here's all the rules for things you can't do. It's easy to forget that celebration is something that we lean into as part of our identity as the people of God. And so I think a discipline of the Spirit is like God is involved in celebrating with us. If we're partying, and there's 12 of us partying there's a 13th sort of person present, and that is God who's sharing in the delight with us. So that would be, if I put it in there, that's why. If it was Foster, then I have no idea.
Might just be another way of saying a spiritual discipline that.
Yeah.
And now we're going to get on to the definition.
Yeah, I think before we move on, I agree. Like, so often enjoying things has been seen as sub-spiritual from early on. We could go back and it's a reminder, like, no, it's not. Like, God actually wants us to enjoy life, not just like trudge through until He comes back or we die. Like, that's, and so I think it doesn't hurt to remind us of that what we're going to be talking about is not sub-spiritual, but in fact it's one of the sort of foundational things that God wants us to do and to experience here on earth.
Yeah, I think that people have this idea that somehow to be somber is to be more religious. If you're laughing, if there's joy, well, that's just not religious. It doesn't feel right. And I'm with you. I think that God is a God of joy. He wants to see His people experiencing joy, and it's something you do together. You can't celebrate by yourself. That just would seem so weird to me. And so celebrations are something that God has instilled in His body, going all the way back to Israel. And we were joking about it before we hit record, but when I preach on the Old Testament and the various feasts they have, I keep saying God wants His people to throw parties. And there's a godly way to do it, obviously, but it's about joy and celebration and excitement. And I love that we're saying this is a spiritual thing. It's not just a human thing. It's not just a fleshly thing. It's something that comes from God's Spirit.
So, as for the definition, I think there's one thing I might revise. Like, this seems to be a definition about how to celebrate in all times.
Mm-hmm.
And because that ending, like choosing to acknowledge and enjoy the goodness of God, period. Like, that to me seems like celebration, regardless of circumstances. That almost makes it sound like, forget the circumstances. This is about choosing. But I think a lot of celebrations are precisely because of the circumstances. God has done something big in our midst, and we are celebrating in response to a specific circumstance that we acknowledge His goodness in. So I think when you're trying to celebrate in bad times, then it's like celebrating His goodness despite the times. But when the times are good and you see God acting, it's precisely because of the circumstance and in response to it.
Yeah, that also jumped out at me, that regardless of the circumstances, because I think it flies in the face of like a time to rejoice and a time to mourn. There are times for different things. In the time of mourning, you don't just say, no, stop, we're going to turn this around and celebrate. That may happen eventually, but that doesn't have to be the immediate thing we do. And so I think he goes just a little too far. Like, I'm for enjoying the goodness of God, and part of the problem of our culture is we refuse to look at good things. It's always focusing on the bad things. I'm for not doing that, but the discipline of celebration, I don't know. We can talk about what that actually means and looks like. Whether it's like we always got to turn things back to celebration. I don't think takes our circumstances seriously enough.
Well, I'm not sure he would say we always have to turn things
Fair.
back towards fasting or any of the disciplines
Right.
necessarily, but he might be suggesting that the discipline of celebration is most discipline when it is a time you don't feel like celebrating, but it is a time that calls for celebration.
That'd be interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to suss that out. What that, because some people may feel like celebrating, but you don't, and so is it like joining them in that, even though you're not in a place for that?
I think that's an example.
Okay.
But I mean, I can see where celebration is still a discipline because you have, prescribed feasts in the Old Testament. And on the one hand, those feasts commemorate what God has done, like Passover. God did this amazing thing in our history that we want to keep remembering. And so we have a celebration, and that is a discipline. It's like we don't get just to choose to, we do it every year at this time. In conjunction with those celebrations are, harvest times. It's not that we saw God, not just that we saw God do this amazing thing, but we grew enough food this year. Let's have a feast. We're celebrating the fact that we had a good crop. And so those are all cyclical. You don't just say, hey, let's throw a party this weekend. It is a discipline that you do. And so I can see where those kind of prescribed feasts fit into the idea of a discipline.
Yeah, I'm more on board with that. Like here sometimes hear people say like, oh, it just doesn't feel like Christmas. Well, why not? Well, we're missing this person this year, or we don't have this and that and take place. And yet, that's a time where we can celebrate God coming into the world as a human being, right? And so you can still do that despite your circumstances not being the greatest. But you don't have to do that every single day of the year, right? And so, like you said, the prescribed times, like we're remembering, we're doing this thing, we're celebrating this thing that God has done in our lives or in the world, even if things aren't always that great in my personal life. And I'm for that as opposed to the constant turning it around. Yeah. And as you said, he probably doesn't mean that either.
Yeah, I think that I think he doesn't, but I don't know the man personally. I think I have a definition that I think supplements. We've done this a few times throughout as we've looked at
every
I think,
time, really.
Considering Foster's definition, then I have another definition that I proposed to the class. Whoops, I bet that was loud. Whoops, sorry about that. Just bumped a spring thing. Okay, so another definition: celebration, applying our collective focus towards the good we share, which doesn't require bad circumstances and doesn't require good circumstances either. But the discipline would be applying our collective focus towards the good we share.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think part of me feels like I'm starting to spill over into the conversation we're going to have here towards the end of this episode. But like discipline is it's something you do because you have to do it. There's good disciplines. A musician has to practice every single day. An athlete has to practice everything single day. And so disciplines are something you do because you just know you're supposed to do it. And sometimes you're just in the mood and you want to, and sometimes you don't. But you do it anyway. And so celebration as a discipline seems like you're doing it because we know we should. Sometimes you're just really happy to do it. But other times it's like, I don't necessarily feel like celebrating. I'm not in the mood to do it. But it's Passover, it's Christmas, it's whatever. And so we are going to do it. And so I'm thinking about celebration, not just in the generic sense, but celebration as a discipline.
Yeah, I like the two elements you include in here. I mean, it's something we do collectively. We focus on the same thing together at the same time. I think that's great emphasis here. And it's celebration because we're focusing on a good. Right, and so it's a cause for celebration as opposed to mourning. So I have no problem with it. I don't think you're trying to give a full definition of it, but that you're highlighting those two aspects of it, and I think they're worth highlighting.
I think really what I like the most about it is it's the good we share, like you talked about, because perhaps the discipline of it is forcing yourself to celebrate with other people when you're not in that place. I helped my wife out. She teaches third grade field day about a week and a half ago, which is the worst day of the year for teachers. But anyway, and
for students.
Yeah, but only if they appropriate it, if they come at it with the appropriate attitude. If it's we got to win every single game, our team, it's going to be a long, awful day. Because they're not going to, and they're going to get mad at their teammates and all the rest. But my wife made it clear, we're going to celebrate everyone finishing. You can celebrate your team, you got first place, but then you turn and you look at the rest of the team, the rest of the groups, and you cheer them on because like they're part of your class. And like I feel like that's kind of getting at the celebration discipline is just like, you're cheering on, you're celebrating things that exist in the world that are good in the life of the community that aren't necessarily yours, but that does good things for us. Even though we're not experiencing that ourselves, like it's better for us. It's better for our brains and our emotions if we're like, as he says, turning towards the goodness that we share. And so I really like that last part. The good we share, I think, is vital because it's not always something good that's happened to me.
This whole definition reminds me of 1 Corinthians, and like when one member of the body rejoices, we all rejoice with it.
Yeah.
Right. And when suffers, we all suffer with it. It's just recognizing this is a discipline because ordinarily we would say it's this person's accomplishment. They're the ones who should be happy. But as a community, no, we're saying we're focusing our whole life around enjoying your victory, realizing that it's not just your victory, it's a victory for you, for your family, for your friends, and for this whole community, that you graduated, that that you got married, or insert whatever. I think this collective nature, we're focusing on one thing, and it's a good, and our society might not celebrate it collectively in the same way, or even believe that they share it in the way that as a believing community we do.
And I would say it keeps us from selfishness or jealousy as well. Because our culture, someone succeeds, now we're figuring out a way, well, what about mine? Or I'm as good as them.
Yeah.
And this discipline says, no, it's not about that. It's about the other person. And I'm going to keep it about them as opposed to trying to one up them or bring them down because they're succeeding and I'm not. And so I think that's a really valuable thing in our culture. It's not just about having parties. It's about changing our mindset completely.
Yeah, I should have brought this up earlier, but I had, quite frankly, I'd forgotten about it and noticed it in my notes a little bit lower down. Foster makes a helpful distinction, talking about like the regardless of circumstances qualifier and the collective good we share, like all of this stuff. He wants us to avoid the willful ignorance mentality that says, I'm just going to choose to be happy even though everything's terrible. This is something you were talking about earlier. I think you'd find he agrees a lot more with the position you expressed than what I initially made it sound. He is careful to say that as we're sort of turning our collective focus towards good, or we're celebrating regardless of circumstances, acknowledging goodness, all that, it's not like we're pretending that there aren't bad things present either. So it could be, on field day or whatever, somebody gets injured. Can everybody else still have fun? Even though that one person is injured, like it is sad that they are injured, but does that ruin the whole field day for everyone? Because our collective good is now completely dissolved because this one student has twisted their ankle and they have to sit out. I think that's a way of thinking about the discipline as well. And like in my own personal experience, when I go to celebrations like a wedding, I'm glad John brought up that wedding, because I can think of an example where I went to a wedding and was extremely not in the mood. Perhaps you can relate.
Only everyone.
Like I felt like on the way there, I had this acute sense that I have the opportunity to ruin this for them if I'm not careful. If like my presence could be, they would regret inviting me. If I don't like sort of get it together, if I don't think about how am I going to be present amidst this celebration, I don't have to pretend like the things that I'm experiencing, I'm not experiencing. I don't have to be willfully ignorant as though they're not happening, but I am going to discipline myself to just be joyful for this couple that's celebrating something wonderful.
Yeah, you can be joyful for them, not necessarily in your own life. It flies in the face of the Bobby McFerrin, don't worry, be happy. Like as though those other things don't exist. Just be happy. Like, oh, okay, I'll just be happy then. And that's not what I appreciate the distinction. That's not what he's asking us to do. So yeah,
I should have said that earlier, but hey, we got to it eventually.
Yeah.
I have some Foster quotes, and I at least want to do two of them. I think this one is really clutch, so we're going to do this one first. So here's a quote from his book: "Without a joyful spirit of festivity, the disciplines, that's all the disciplines to be clear, the disciplines become dull, death-breathing tools in the hands of modern Pharisees."
Agreed. I mean, it becomes a checklist. It becomes I'm supposed to do this, and if it's not done with the spirit of, this is giving me the opportunity to grow closer to God and to God's people, then what are we doing? And what we're doing is we're checking boxes and we're becoming unhappy. And I think it is a great quote.
Yeah, it's funny because I think about certain things that I do, like over the summer. Today, sometime this afternoon, I got to get out and work in the garden. We've had some rain lately, and all of a sudden the weeds are just coming up like crazy. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to get out there and weed that. And I know some people are like, oh, that sounds like a horrible way to spend your summer. Well, for me, it's still a celebration. I'm doing it as a discipline thing. It needs to be done. But I'm also celebrating. I'm like, I'm looking forward to what's going to come out of this. And all the disciplines can be that. Yes, you're doing it as a discipline, but you also know what the product of that discipline is going to be. And that is definitely worth celebrating. Like, I'm just so excited about harvest time that I'm happy to go out and work in the garden for a while. It's a discipline, but it's also a celebration. So I think it's a both and.
I mean, you bring up a really good point about it's putting your eyes on the final goal, the fruit of it.
Yeah.
You put all this work in, and the work's not great, but you know what's going to happen at the end. And I think, this leads to kind of the disciplines that are moving in that direction. Like, yeah, it's work to fast. It's work to get up and be alone. Not for me, but but
Right.
it's work to do the disciplines. But it's not about the work. It's about the fruit and the final goal. And that's what brings you the joy and keeps you going through some of the more difficult seasons of doing the disciplines.
I think this works for most of them. Like fasting, I'm not sure it's right to approach it with a joyful spirit of festivity because of what it is in some circumstances. But I think, this is the mood that should be in our worship. It should be in our celebration. It should be, in most of the
Service.
disciplines, right? Yeah. So I think it's good. I don't like throwing the Pharisees under the bus at the end, but
Modern Pharisees, not the old Pharisees, the modern ones.
right.
But I mean, in Jesus' own words, he says you tie heavy burdens around the necks
The bad ones do.
Yeah, sure.
The old school Pharisees.
In the 1980s, that was all of them. We've
Yes.
got more nuance now than we did then.
That's true.
Nicodemus didn't.
That's right.
Okay, there's more. There's maybe more I want to say about that, but we're gonna discipline and
Oh, very
celebrate
good.
that discipline.
Very
I've got one more quote,
Very
and then I
cool.
want to make some practical suggestions. So I'll just give this quote because it's kind of just a holy harumph moment. I think celebration brings joy into life, and joy makes us strong. Man, the class loves that quote. It's always it's just such an encouragement to me to say that the disciplines as a whole are meant to do this. They as a package are about strengthening us, bringing joy into our lives, which is the exact opposite, I would say, preconceived notion that people typically bring into our class is the disciplines are the parts that you don't enjoy, but it's worth it because this, that. It's like, no, the whole thing can be enjoyed and is worth it. Even those moments, I would contend, even those moments of fasting where it's like, we are doing this because joy is absent. This, in a sense, it's not like a formula where we do this, therefore joy is restored, but we kind of have this sense that it's not right that joy is absent. And so we're going to do a discipline in response to the absence of joy, because joy should be the default setting, so to speak. So a couple practical suggestions. I think and have come to believe that the much sort of derided and mocked church potluck is the answer to the modern question of how do we celebrate after COVID. We got really scared about germs for a little bit, and we got really scared about how to share food and what should happen with all that sort of stuff. And some of that we should be scared about. Like, look up the statistics on how many people get food poisoning from mayonnaise that sits out in the sun at church picnics. It's startling. And yes, Barna Group does track that.
Wow.
So don't,
Yeah, I did
right,
not
there's,
know that.
mayonnaise.
as if pastors out there, watch the food, right? Like you've entered an area that's not your area, so figure out how to do food correctly. But church potlucks, man, they're like, this is it's a community experience. It's an opportunity for people to get together. You encourage them to sit at tables where they don't know people. This is an opportunity to recapture celebration in the contemporary setting, and it's underestimated. And even in huge contexts, like I'm thinking of, like, my brother goes to a church where the campus is about 1,000 people. Are they going to have a church potluck there? The answer is yes, they are. They're going to figure out how to do that in a way that makes sense to them. They were just telling me recently about wild game dinners that they do. This is northern,
that
right?
sounds
Northern Michigan, man. So everybody and their brother is hunting up there, and they've got all kinds of meat to share, and it's a beautiful experience. They have a devotional as part of it, and everyone is just united in celebration over
Except for the vegetarians.
the harvest. Yeah,
Fair enough.
They'll have to have their own.
They're out there
wild
hunting the wild
flower.
vegetables, you know.
Wild berries.
Yeah, the
Wild
mushrooms that
berries.
grow out in the middle of the
My
woods.
brother will have to correct me, but I think there are vegetarian options actually at that. I think they've even thought of
Nice.
that.
Yeah,
But
Good
anyhow,
for them.
Good for
so the potluck. Okay, so and then again, another suggestion is I sort of alluded to it in my example before. As you're heading into a corporate space, we as a collective, we need to think a little bit more intentionally about what we as an individual are bringing into the collective. We sometimes think that we get to exist in the state that we're in and pretend that that's not going to impact other people. But when you come in, not to be harsh on anybody or anything, but when you come in real crappy and you're just crappy to everybody, that impacts the gathering. That impacts the celebration. And we think we're entitled to that because we've been told by our society that we're entitled to that, because if we're in a bad mood, then everybody else has to be too. I don't think that's true. And I think the discipline of celebration pushes back firmly against that. Who are you when you enter the gathering, and what are you bringing to the gathering? Not to be fake, not to pretend, but to bring your authentic, joyful self into the gathering, perhaps in spite of circumstances, to call back to Foster.
Well, I think we have a joyful self in there, because you're right. Being fake, everybody's just going to know that's just not useful. But there is places of joy inside of us that we can tap into. It might take a little bit extra work. I understand that. But I think you make a great point. It's not about me. It's about the group. And I want to be good to them. And I know I'm in a bad mood, or I know something bad has happened. I'm not trying to ignore that. But I care enough about those people that I want my contribution to be something that's going to lift them up and not tear them down. And so it's finding that place inside you that taps into the joys that we do have and allowing those to determine our mood. So, yeah, I don't think you have to be fake. I think it could be real.
Okay.
Well, this has been Spiritual Disciplines.
101.
With Todd Jones.
Again, not an exhaustive list, but hopefully there's been something practical and useful in here, or something clarifying about a discipline that has been maybe shrouded in mystery or confusion. I've enjoyed this, but I think it's time for us to shift gears a little bit. We had teased earlier in the series that maybe at some point we'd have a conversation about something. Can I kick it over to Sam, introduce us?
Sure. So throughout, we brought up a couple times and touched on different ones, but for me, there are always these two lingering questions about the spiritual disciplines. One, how are they spiritual, and how are they a discipline? So the spiritual part is, what's the difference between some person who doesn't know Jesus or care about Jesus going and serving food at a food bank on Thanksgiving versus the spiritual discipline of service? And what's the difference between just praying, like randomly praying, and the spiritual discipline of praying? These are just examples of how do we make these 12 things, spiritual disciplines, as opposed to just activities that are part of our lives. So those are my questions. Answer them, Ron.
Well, I can only give my own thoughts or opinions or whatever word we were talking about the other day.
You have all the opinions, but not the answers. Yep.
Exactly. But I think part of what makes it spiritual is that even though we're doing a lot of the same things, for us it's grounded in God's revelation of himself and what his thoughts were when he said, "Let there be light." That he had plans for humanity and for his creation, not just for humanity, but for his creation. And so when we begin to align ourselves with God and his intentions for his creation, that even though we do what other people do, we do it from a different place, and we do it with a different set of priorities and, at least to some degree, some different goals. And so I think part of what makes it spiritual is the starting point, and it begins with understanding God and his intention for all of his creation and coming into alignment with that.
So the starting point.
Yeah, where it begins.
Okay. So I think you can go to the other end of the spectrum and also say the ending point, like toward what end,
agree.
Mm-hmm.
toward what purpose. And I think that would have to be, the spiritual disciplines would have to be toward the purpose of the church being God's people in the world, guided by his Spirit to bear witness to God's kingdom on behalf of the world. And so I think so in that is, the ultimate kingdom objective, that is the mission of God's people, that these disciplines would take place in the context of that story toward that end. And probably, grows out of our conviction that, God gave us his Spirit for a reason, right? To empower us for kingdom mission and kingdom service. And so the conviction that the Spirit is at work in these disciplines in our lives, I think, two elements.
So you're suggesting there's different outcomes for the Christian who's dedicating, say, the food kitchen, whatever, the service to God, and the other person is just doing it to be a nice person. There are different outcomes that come from that. The Spirit uses them in different ways.
Yeah, from our perspective, we may be doing them for different reasons
Mm-hmm.
than our neighbor who's not a believer. Like they're just trying to be a good person,
Right.
And they genuinely care about people and want to do something to help out. Those are our motives too, but more than that, we want to do it in such a way that we hope, because we are doing this as the body of Christ, that they will see Christ in us. They will be drawn to Christ in us. They will catch a glimpse of the kingdom, and ultimately they might be incorporated into it. That's how. So it's not like what they're doing, what's physically happening is different between a believer and an unbeliever in these practices. Although the motive behind it, the motives could overlap greatly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we assume that an unbeliever is ever doing something just for selfish reasons, right?
Yeah.
I would assume the best for why they're doing what they're doing, even when that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
But the spirit factor, I think, is unique, which doesn't mean it's not a spiritual discipline if the Holy Spirit doesn't show up. But our conviction is that the Holy Spirit is present and active in our life, and our invitation is for the Holy Spirit to work in us as we devote our time to these activities.
Yeah, I can see somebody like a Christian serving in a soup kitchen and just having conversations. Why are you here? Why'd you come out today to serve? And a non-believer will have good things to say. I want to help people out. It makes me feel good. I feel like I've done something for the people around me. And they can talk about those benefits, but a believer is going to go beyond that and say that, God has called us to something greater. We're doing the same thing. I'm not trying to criticize what this person is doing. They're doing a good thing. But I just see it through a much broader lens, that there are elements to this that are important to me that I don't hear in other people's conversations. I think that's part of how we can be a witness, is to say there's so much more going on here, and that I am invited into this, and I'm really pursuing objectives that are just beyond me or even just beyond the community, but tap into the creator of heaven and earth. And that's how we can be that witness, and doing it with joy. When it's a celebration, I'm happy to be here. Bringing God into that conversation is part of the witness. And we're hoping that people are going to go, wow, yeah, okay, that's fantastic. Tell me more about this God.
What you're saying actually really reminds me of my dissertation. It's not a selfless plug. Just this idea of form and function, that two people doing the exact same thing, whatever it might be. The form is the same, but the function is very different. And even like thinking about the prayer of a non-believer could be like one out of I don't know anything about God or whether God exists, but I'm going to do this prayer, as opposed to the prayer of the believer who has faith that God hears and responds. These are very different, and they're going to have different outcomes, but they can look the same. And so I think that's what you're getting at, which I think it's helpful for us to view how we view spiritual disciplines.
In personal spiritual formation too, we imagine that practices that we're doing are shaping us. So far, as I've understood what we've said, we're talking quite a lot about outcomes, which is a critical, important component, not to minimize that. But we're hoping for things like people will see the love of Christ in us and recognize who God is as a result of these acts or whatever. We're trying to get a realization to happen in somebody else, but there's also realizations that need to happen in us, and those things don't always happen as a result of an intellectual assent or somebody carefully explaining it to us in a sermon or around a coffee table. I think that there's something to be said for when I go to perform the exact same act that somebody else is going to perform. The thing that I think I'm doing to myself is quite different than the thing they think they're doing to themselves as well. And I have a long-term objective about the person that I believe I'm becoming. And not that people who aren't followers of Christ can't also have long-term goals. But my goal might be I'm making this earnest attempt to become something, and I'm doing this thing to shape me as much as it might be to shape others. For me, that's a pretty critical part of the distinction as well. So what makes it spiritual is my belief that, I think I used this analogy many weeks ago now, I am a rock in a river that is over a long period of time getting smoothed out by the rushing water. And this is more of that water, like shaping and forming me slowly over time so that I might become something.
Yeah, talking about the idea of what makes it spiritual, what makes it a discipline. I think it's a challenge for us as Christians to basically commit all things in our lives to Christ, which we don't do. And so, I think, I probably mentioned, Brother Lawrence and practicing the presence of God and how somehow he can be washing dishes and yet some be praising God. And so each there's different aspects, facets of our lives, right? In difficult times, what does it look like to dedicate that to God? In great times, what does that look like? When we're wanting answers. And so it's about having things in place where we can redirect whatever's going on to God. Because most of us just, I think, turn it inward, and we try to deal with it ourselves. And so the disciplines give us tools to really, take each thought captive, and all the things that the Bible challenges us to do that we don't do very often. And so that's, for me, that's why they can be very helpful. And it's not about just the goal, right, being a better person, but it's about just changing the way we view the world and how we go through the world.
Which I would, the word that's in my head as you're describing that is transformation.
Yeah.
I would call that,
Yeah.
right, the transformation by the renewal of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what we're putting into our minds is sort of, this is a weird mixed metaphor, is kind of coming into our minds through our hands, like through what we're expressing in service to the outer world. It's like our whole being is being transformed as we are committing ourselves to these practices, such that that daily renewal thing that is both promised and anticipated in Romans 12 is going to happen. It's like the disciplines are a vehicle by which we engage proactively the transformation that the Spirit is accomplishing in us.
And in particular, transformation into the image of Christ,
Yeah.
right? Because it's through Christ and His image that God's mission in this world is carried out. I think a lot of what we've said speaks to the spiritual, what makes them spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still a little fuzzy on what makes them disciplines, and I'm leaning toward thinking for it to be categorized as a discipline than just like a one-off thing that happened, there's a kind of intentionality about it being regular.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very word in my mind, that idea of regularity, that it's not something we do occasionally, but, daily, weekly, whatever the regularity is. There's got to be a rhythm to our life that this fits into, and that's what makes it a discipline. And then that takes us into that idea of transformation. I like that image, of the water smoothing out a rock, that it's just something that's constantly happening because that regularity is changing me into something, that conformity to Christ. Without the regularity, then that transformation is compromised.
I can't help but be practical on things. That's just how I'm wired. So you're talking about doing them regularly with intentionality, bringing them rhythms. So to talk about practically speaking, how do you engage these 12 plus? Do you say, you know what, for this season, I'm going to really work on this one. And then once that becomes part of my rhythm, I'm going to add another one. Or do you just try to, shotgun it and do them all at the same time? Because I think, our listeners might wonder, like, okay, I like what you said. I think I should do these things. Now, how do I get started?
If Foster were here, I think he would say it starts with prayer. And I would want to agree with that we need to be, again, all kinds of mixing metaphors happening. Sorry, everybody.
We love it.
We need to be like in tune with what's going on in our own spiritual life. And the one who reveals that is God. If we're not talking to God at all about where we're at, like what do we even need to work on? Where do we start? Where do we begin? I think we reattach ourselves to the source of the transformation. We reattach ourselves to the relationship that we have with God, and prayer is just the most obvious and direct way to engage that relationship.
Yeah, it seems like you can break them down into certain disciplines are daily disciplines. Like we shouldn't do these once a week or once a month, but they should be daily. But other ones are going to be maybe less frequent. Fasting every single day doesn't seem quite right, And so trying to understand what ones are the more daily disciplines. I think you're right. Prayer, I think, is a great place to start. It should be a daily discipline. And then, from ultimately disciplines, we got to figure out where they fit into those rhythms. But certain ones certainly lend themselves to being daily.
John just agrees.
Yeah, I have nothing to add.
Maybe speaking from my own experience, when I feel, to use that metaphor again, in tune with what's going on in my spiritual life, it becomes quite obvious where my weak points are. So then I'm like, wow, I have just not been self-reflective at all. I need to meditate. I need to just contemplate what God has been doing. Maybe not as a proactive prayer conversation with God, but like I just need to sit with all of this. I've been moving so quickly and been so busy, whatever. I just haven't done any of that. Meditation is this weakness right now. Or, like happened to me the other day. I just shared this with Ron earlier. I got really sick. I went to the doctor's office. I stepped on the scale and I saw a lifetime high on my weight. And I was like, I am not self-controlled. I'm completely lacking discipline in my food and what I'm putting into my body and in my habits and rhythms. It was just revealed to me in this moment of clarity and in this conversation with God that's ongoing. It's like kind of look up at God and God's like, you noticed finally, huh? It's like, yeah, yeah, I did. I guess I probably better do something about that, huh? And God's like, yeah.
While you're young enough to be able to make a difference.
Well, it's not the weight, it's the self-control, right? Like I have let myself go into patterns of drinking way too much soda and relying on chemical stimulants like energy drinks to get me through working hours. Like, no, that's not healthy. Stop that and reattach. And I think I'm aware of that because of a relationship with God that doesn't just go to the doctor and see a high number and just like, oh, whoops, and go home and not, I don't know. I think that there's this connection that since it's alive with a relational being, God is revealing things in real time. And I go, oh, that's what I need to work on. Then I emphasize that for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How about you, Sam?
Which part? Am I overweight? Yes. What are you talking about?
The questions you pose.
So I grew up with this book, and I tried to do it I'm going to start with this one, and I'm going to, work through it. And, you give it a go for a while, and it doesn't necessarily, it may or may not become part of your rhythm. And I think what you say is important because just starting at chapter 1, I don't even know what chapter 1 is, whichever the first is it prayer?
Meditation,
yeah.
I think.
Like, that may not be what a person needs right now, but I think there needs to be some intentionality. It's not like, and the intentionality is not, okay, from 8 to 8:30, I'm going to pray, 8:30 to 9, we're going to meditate, 9 to 9:30. Like, that's not necessarily it. So it's a fine balance between being intentional to do these things, but not being too, like, legalistic, programmatic about it. And I don't know that I found the balance yet. And if people out there have, I'd be interested in hearing from them. But it's somewhere in there, both are at play, because if you're not intentional, it won't happen. Same like you can say, oh, I need to lose weight. Is there a plan? Right? No, there's not. And so then nothing's going to change. So for me, it's about just trying to figuring out where I am on that to really embrace it. And like I said, but for me, it's about taking the opportunity to just sanctify everything, to dedicate everything, no matter what it is. Even if I'm mowing the lawn, is this an act of service to my family, right? And to God's creation? And so do I view it that way, or like, oh, I got to get this stupid thing done? And so for me, that's the challenge for the disciplines, is that allows more opportunity to really embrace them as discipline than as a thing we do.
Yeah. And I think some of the practices have become a way of life for us. Mm-hmm. We don't think about them. They're second nature. Others are not. And so I feel like, I think about the disciplines in relation to soccer. No one had to train me how to run. Like I just, I ran effortlessly. I ran fast. It's like I didn't need to give any extra attention to running, but dribbling without looking down, right? Kicking with my left foot and not just my right foot. Like that required some intentional focus, repetition. And I feel like with the spiritual disciplines, it may be like that, where some are just, it's a part of our life. It has already become a discipline and way of life. And others are untapped resources that would improve our witness, improve our service. And that would require maybe a little more routine and intentionality game plan, like you were saying.
Okay.
I got nothing to add to that.
All right. Well, I guess that's the end of this series. We hope you've enjoyed it. And again, give your kudos to Todd if you feel so moved.
We'll miss having you at the table.
Well,
I will miss it. I can't. I'm sorry. I spoke for the other guys. I will miss
please
having
don't
you.
speak for me.
I'll
It's a little crowded if you don't. No, but seriously, thank you. And yeah, we look forward to what God will do through this podcast and you in the future. Yeah, you never know.
Yes, indeed.
Want to kick off our sign off?
Kick off our sign off.
Gotta remember how it goes. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the After Class podcast.
After class because
The best conversations happen.
After class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.